what led to them getting to the point that they were successful, or when they crash and burn, they still want to know the backstory. So you always need your founder origin story. To me, that's the most important story every founder has, because it shows who you are, what makes you special, and how you got to the point that you are today. People connect with people. So we need that personal story first. The second story is the startup vision story. This is really why you decided to start the company that you did, and how it came about, how you thought about it, how you built it. That's the second story. The third story is what I call the future reality story. And this is where you're painting the picture of what it looks like in 5-10 years. You mentioned Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk does this extraordinarily well, where he says he just paints a picture of what it's going to be like when we colonize Mars, right? Even though that is a long ways off. I mean, Elon was talking about colonizing Mars and painting that future reality story long before he was even able to get a rocket off of the launch pad without blowing up. And so the future reality story is the one that paints the big picture ahead. And oftentimes the future reality story for an early stage startup is tied into the startup vision story.
Yo, this is Christian D. Evans with Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to our amazing podcast. This is where we reveal the top 1% of business concepts and systems and processes to scale 8- and 9-figure businesses. We interview top-level 8- and 9-figure CEOs, business owners, and amazing TEDx speakers like David Meltzer. We got Nick Cavuto, Pascal Bachman, and so many others. And if you feel like this resonates with you, please share this with your friend, your family, and make sure you impact them as well, because we're trying to spread the message on those that do not know how to scale 8- and 9-figure businesses and talking higher level business concepts. So guys, remember, enjoy the episode and be uncommon if you can. Cheers. Thank you so much for tuning in to Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. I'm your host, as always, Christian D. Evans. And guys, you are in for a treat. People who make history, start movements, and found trillion-dollar companies are master storytellers. That is the quote on this website, performativespeaking.com, and we have the CEO and founder of this company. Now, let me just share with you a little bit of his acronym here. So he has philosophy behind performative speaking developed from Robbie's career as a trial lawyer in 102 jury trials and leading the national mock trial team at SMU Law School. He learned that these first principles, he realized that tech startup founders needed help with storytelling. His core question became, how can I help people with world-changing ideas actually communicate those ideas to change the world? We are so excited about diving into some really, really deep stuff, but also how to steward what we're going to share today effectively and ethically. Please welcome the CEO and founder of Performative Speaking, my friend, Robbie Crabtree. How you doing today, Robbie?
I'm great, Christian. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the warm intro there and all the kind words. I'm excited to dive into it all today.
Well, I'd love to talk. Obviously, we're going to be talking about the storytelling, the methodology, and really just making that angel cocktail, right? But before we do this, I want to talk a little bit about, I love what you said here, storytellers shape the future on your website here, and become a world-class storyteller. And, you know, we can think of Oprah, we can think of Martin Luther King, we can think about JFK, we can think about Steve Jobs, right? Some of these amazing top leaders, even Elon Musk, really just top notch. He's never really had to spend on advertising in his companies because he's just a massive marketer and storyteller. My question during your journey, Robbie, what helped you identify this in your own life?
There's the great quote by Jobs, right? Which is, you can only connect the dots when you look in reverse. And he said that at the Stanford commencement speech in 2005. And a lot of that is true for me as well. When I think about it, I look back, I grew up with my father telling me stories about his travels, about the business that he built. So I started picking it up there. I competed in debate and extemporaneous speaking at my high school. So started to learn storytelling there. But it was really this moment as a trial lawyer in my 8th jury trial that led me to really dive into this world and figure out, why is this such a magical thing if you do it right? And it was actually a case that I thought I was going to win. I had everything in order, facts, logic, the law, nothing could go wrong, except it did. because the jury gave a 2-word verdict when I was expecting a 1-word verdict. So they said not guilty in this case. And it was in the hallway that I really had this awakening, because I listened to them as they were talking to the defendant. They said this: you know you were guilty. We know you were guilty, but you made us feel something when you told us your story about where you wanted to go in the future. And so I walked up to him and said, hold on, you just said that you knew he was guilty. Why did you say not guilty? And said, because his story connected with us. And Robbie, you were just talking about facts. And honestly, we just didn't care about what you had to say. And it was that moment in jury trial 8 that had this like light bulb moment of, what am I doing? How did I make this mistake? Now, luckily at the time, it was a driving while intoxicated case. It was a low-level case. And I knew that if I was going to get to the cases I wanted to try, which were murders, gang cases, capital murders, child abuse cases, I needed to be the best in the courtroom to win. And it was there that I realized that the game I played was competitive storytelling. So that's when I really dove into figuring out how could I be the best storyteller in a courtroom to win these cases, to get justice and make sure that that event that happened in trial number 8 never happened to me again.
See, this is interesting. And I love that you were able to dial that into that one moment. So when you realized that in the hallway, let's talk a bit about that journey itself, because that helped build the foundation to obviously this well-established company now. And just reiterate here real quick, you've helped almost founders raise $315 million because of this platform that you built. So the huge accolades on that. So let's talk a bit about this journey. You got that point, you started realizing storytelling is so impactful, even to outlay a guilty situation in a non-guilty. And so what questions did you start asking yourself? Or did you start analyzing that? What you did, how they effectively, maybe told the story more effective than you did? Explain that a little bit further.
That insight led me to diving down the rabbit hole to figure out, okay, well then if they said it was the story that connected to them, what does that look like for me moving forward? So you named a bunch of people who actually are part of the logo on my website, right? Jobs, Oprah, JFK, MLK, these sort of leaders. So I started diving into them and seeing what were they able to do when they were speaking to an audience. So I was a history major as well in college. I love the West Wing. So I started paying attention to these sources that I was drawn towards and said, what were they able to do? But then I started going to the best trial lawyers that were in our courthouse too. And I would just watch trial after trial after trial and see what are they doing well. And then I would go and ask them, and I would just try to spend time around them and just absorb what was going on. And then of course you go down the rabbit hole of research and you're watching YouTube videos and you're reading books, and you can see a number of books behind me, right? You read fiction books and fantasy books and sci-fi books, but you read also books by Counselor, which is Ted Sorensen, who wrote for JFK, and you read Steve Jobs, and you dive into all of these pieces, human psychology, brain science, influence, classic oratory and classic rhetoric, things like Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, and what were they doing back then to move the masses, and how do I lean into that so that we can combine the right content, the right structure, the right perspective, the right delivery, so that there's cadence and rhythm and musicality in the way that we speak. And so over that coming, 6 years as a trial lawyer, that's where I just spent an obsessive amount of time on this idea. And ultimately, after 102, that's when I said, all right, we're going to go do this in a different world and take these lessons. But that's really the journey that led me down that path, was losing that and then just absorbing everything that I possibly could.
So let's dive into this head. I mean, all in, 100%. I have studied this, and I love, and I think this could be a cool vibe where we're going to have a good conversation. Let me ask you, Robbie, when you're having a conversation with someone, do you reverse engineer? And what I mean by this is, do you ask yourself, okay, what story, not do I want to tell, but what is the emotion do I want them to feel with this story? And then be able to kind of develop the structure of that. Help me understand your methodology when you're going into this.
Yeah, so this is actually, you bring up what I called the performance speaking framework, which is a 5-piece framework that I use with any person I talk to about how do you think about being an audience-centric speaker to connect with them. It's 5 parts. It's what is the goal? What is the emotion you want them to feel? What's your hook? What's your theme? And what's your dismount? And if we think about the first 2 are strategy, the last 3 are really tactics. But I'll use a real example of this. So the last trial I ever tried, jury trial 102, it was a murder case, and I actually was on the defense side. So I tried 2 cases as a defense lawyer. I tried the first 100 as a prosecutor. On this one, though, I believe that the defendant, my client, was acting in self-defense. So he had killed his brother. It was a tragedy. It was a horrible situation. But I did not believe that this man should be going to prison or convicted of murder. But it was on video that he had killed his brother. He said some terrible things in the aftermath. He, in that kind of fight or flight mode, made some mistakes. And it was in a rural part of Texas that was pretty hardcore. You kill somebody, you're going to prison. So I had to figure out, how am I going to get my audience, the jury in this case, to say, even though you killed someone, we're going to find you not guilty and let you go home. And what I did is I went to an inspiration source. I figured this out when I had felt the sort of feeling that I wanted the jury to feel. And it was a scene from The West Wing. I mentioned that's one of my favorite shows. And it was an episode in the first season called Take This Sabbath Day. And in this scene, one of the characters, Toby, is talking to his rabbi about capital punishment. And what I did is I looked at that scene and said, why does this scene move me in such a powerful way? And it was the lighting, it was the pacing, it was the way that they had the conversation, it was some of the words chosen, it was the music, it was the entire vibe and the aesthetic that was going on. So I looked at that and I said, how can I reverse engineer this? How can I take this and put it into a courtroom when I don't have some of the levers of Hollywood to create that feeling? So I had to do it with just the way that I showed up with my presence, with my body language, with the words I chose, with the way that I spoke them. So I had to be soft and intimate. I had to use the right lines. So I took the theme from that little clip, which was vengeance is not Jewish, and I turned it into vengeance is not justice. And that became the theme of the entire closing argument, which the jury really resonated with and connected to the point that when they came back with the not guilty verdict on that murder case and my client was able to walk out free, they said one of the lines that we kept saying over and over and over again inside of our deliberation was vengeance is not justice. And are we giving vengeance or are we giving justice here? And when they went to justice, that was a not guilty verdict, because even though he had killed the man, they were able to realize it was self-defense and that he shouldn't be held liable and thrown to prison for 25 plus years. And so that's an example of where I figured out what I wanted the jury to feel. Then I went to a place that I had felt that, and then I reverse engineered that by delivering that story in such a way that they were able to connect with that and feel that emotion and come to the result that I wanted.
This is so beautiful, man. I love how you just laid that out. So let's dive into a little bit further, okay? So when you're talking about the emotion, I want to dive into this a little bit because you and I know, and I was consuming this content where you have, depending upon how you structure the story, you can elicit certain emotions specifically. Endorphins, which is more of laughter, oxytocin, and dopamine, right? And let me ask you this in regards to oxytocin, because oxytocin, that's more like that sympathy, that empathy, where you share, you're vulnerable, you're authentic, and you're able to feel that human connection. People just, they trust you, they like you, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm curious, in those circumstances, did you reverse engineer and say, okay, hey, I know by being authentic, by being vulnerable, by sharing XYZ for your client testimony or whatever, that would build empathy or build trust with the juror and the judge?
So you're always thinking through the rise and fall of these different emotions and taking your audience on a journey, right? Pixar does this really well. You can see this actually in the opening bit of the movie Up, where you get really excited and then something bad happens and you come back down. They build you back up, they build you back down, they build you back up, build you back down. And that roller coaster is what really keeps us engaged. And so you're doing the same thing with a jury when you're talking to them. So of course I'm aware of dopamine, oxytocin, all the different kind of chemicals that we want to be able to release inside of the audience. Some of that also is cortisol to create some stress, right? Because we're trying to create this pain-pleasure dynamic. Oxytocin where they connect, the cortisol where they're really stressed out about what could happen if they make this alternative choice. And so when we're thinking about oxytocin in this situation, for me, that was the way that I had to deliver it. I had to be very soft and intimate, because if I went up there and yelled at them and said, this is a travesty, I can't believe we're here, what are we doing? Like, the state is so over the top, they would have laughed me out of the room. Because they would have said, Robbie, he killed his brother. Like, that's why we're here. Like, you're being ridiculous. Instead, I had to be very, very gentle, soft, really leave a lot of space, big pauses, make them think about what I had said and feel the weight of the words and the weight of what was coming to them. And then create that connection to my client, the defendant who had killed his brother, and try to lay out why he had already been punished in such a serious way, because he's going to have to live with this the rest of his life, because he didn't want to do this, because it's going to be a prison of his own making for the rest of his time. So you don't need to also add in a prison of the state's making just to feel better about yourselves. And so you do a lot of this work where you're making them really feel that emotional high and low through that journey, where they end up coming to the conclusion of there was only one decision that we were left able to make. Because at the end of the day, what you want as an attorney is to create these really binary options of yes or no, not this middle ground where people can really go off the rails. And so you have to give them a real sense of, is it vengeance that we're after? Is it justice we're after? And the justice piece was all about being soft, intimate, really close to them, and exposing myself, really opening up my heart, my soul, my head, my eyes, to let them see how I saw this, and also how it was already going to affect my client.
This is so beautiful. So let me ask you now in more of the structure of that story a little bit. And I'd like to talk a little bit about this because, again, this is very applicable to any industry. Did you get into the story, which is perfect how you laid that out, but did you add some facts or add certain, substance a little bit to it? And I shouldn't say substance like in a whatever, but you get what I'm saying, like any more data associated with it, why you were telling the story to almost exemplify that emotion or exemplify whatever you were trying to explain? Or did you try to veer away from that because the data and stats, they don't hold as much weight compared to a story?
Well, Brene Brown has a great quote around this idea, right? She says, stories are just data with soul. And that is 100% true. If you can't put data into your story, you're not a very good storyteller. I love data because it talks to the more logical, rational side of the brain. And we've got to be able to speak to both the emotional side and the logical, rational side. If we don't have both of those, we're not going to actually get the outcome that we want, right? We want to hit the emotional side so they're attached, and then the logical, rational so that they can justify and get to that end result that we already know that they're going to get to. So we've got to be able to use data. And so, for instance, in that case, I did a lot of things because, like I said, I'd spent so much time, most of my career as a prosecutor for the last 2 years of that was as a child abuse prosecutor. So I was trying sexual abuse, physical abuse, as well as death cases involving children. And so in that world, we spent a lot of time with specialized training with psychologists, psychiatrists, behavioral scientists, behavioral economics, all these sort of areas that we were able to get specialized training because of the types of cases that we were going into. And using that was actually what allowed me to do some interesting things in the case that I had, where I was bringing in psychiatrists and bringing in facts about how the brain works when you're in these moments of high stress. And so why some of the words that my client had said were actually just a piece of our evolutionary history. Like, he didn't really mean what he was saying. That person that showed up in that moment was very different from the person that he was because he felt like he had to defend himself. We were also looking at statistics, and I would bring in data and statistics about how police officers respond in shooting situations, and showing how, had it have been a police officer shooting, this would have been 100% a justified shoot. And so why is it different that a police officer can do that, but a normal citizen can't? And so I was doing a lot of these analogy pieces and bringing in things that the prosecution was not ready for, because I had spent so much time as a prosecutor and really seen the way the rules of the game work there. I was able to bring in nuances there that they were unprepared for, and create analogies, create data, create statistics, create all of these insights that allowed the jury to say, Robbie's not just spinning a story to me. He's actually giving me the logical, rational stuff behind the story that makes me say, I'm with him. I get this. He's not just trying to sell me a tale. And going back to what you said earlier at the beginning of this podcast, it's about being a good steward of storytelling. I don't want to spin a tale that gets somebody who is really guilty of murder off. I want to make sure that I'm saving the life of somebody that I believe did not commit murder because they were acting in self-defense. And that's where I've got to make sure I'm using the data, using the numbers in a positive way to create a positive impact in the outcome.
Wow, this is really excellent. I love how you got so micro with it. So I want to give a little context to kind of the founders that you've been able to work with a little bit. And then we're going to dive into the physiology, the linguistics, the tonality, the cadence, et cetera, kind of the structure a little bit more so. But kind of give us a little bit context, because I'm always intrigued with, like, to me, I worked with some people in the storytelling world, and they've told me always have like 3 or 4 or 5 stories that you can always work with, depending upon the audience that you're working with, and what kind of message, like you mentioned, what kind of message you want to share, what's the goal of it. and because again, you and I know the power of it. Is that the same with founders that you work with? Like, hey, okay, let's outline maybe 4 or 5, 6 stories that we can always lean on that exemplify the structure of the business and the offer and the opportunity, et cetera.
With founders, you're going to have 3 core stories I think every founder has to have around what they're doing. And then there's going to be a number of other stories, which I like to think of as kind of set pieces that you can always bring into a talk. And I would say that that should be way more than 4, 5, or 6. If you're a truly world-class founder, great founder, and you are going to take your company to these extraordinary heights, you should have 50, 100 stories that you can weave in at any time. And so there's a lot of development that goes into being able to just jump into any of those stories at any time. This is why you have to learn kind of the foundational piece of storytelling, and then you build on top of it and you get very comfortable in this kind of impromptu nature. But the core stories that I think every founder has to have, because you're always going to get asked this, is 1, your founder origin story. We see it over and over on TV right now. The Playlist, We Crashed, Super Pumped, like you name it. Founders are a hot commodity these days, and people want to know what led to them getting to the point that they were successful, or when they crash and burn, they still want to know the backstory. So you always need your founder origin story. To me, that's the most important story every founder has, because it shows who you are, what makes you special, and how you got to the point that you are today. People connect with people, so we need that personal story first. The second story is the startup vision story. This is really why you decided to start the company that you did, and how it came about, how you thought about it, how you built it. That's the second story. The third story is what I call the future reality story. And this is where you're painting the picture of what it looks like in 5, 10 years. You mentioned Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk does this extraordinarily well, where he says, he just paints a picture of what it's going to be like when we colonize Mars, right? Even though that is a long ways off. I mean, Elon was talking about colonizing Mars and painting that future reality story long before he was even able to get a rocket off of the launch pad without blowing up. And so the future reality story is the one that paints the big picture ahead. And oftentimes the future reality story for an early stage startup is tied into the startup vision story. As you get to a later stage, so Series A and beyond, they tend to separate. The startup vision story is looking at how your startup started and got to the point you are today. And then the future reality story is showing where it's going in the future and what that big dream is. So because you have more information and more time, you have to actually separate them into kind of a three-act storyline. And all of those should fit together seamlessly. If you were to ask a founder to give the whole history, they should be able to go founder origin story, startup vision story, future reality story, and it should be one cohesive narrative.
Wow, that's excellent, man. So origin story, vision story, and future. And like you mentioned, it's depending upon where that company is at as well. If it's a pre-seed and Series A, you need to be focused on origin and vision. And then of course, Series A and onward, that's more that future reality a little bit as well. Okay, I like that structure. Really, really, really spot on. I want to ask you about the physiology, the linguistics, the tonality, the cadence, the terminology that you use within the actual story, right? I think we've all heard where, hey, you start with the intensity. Some movies start with Mission Impossible does this quite a bit. They start with that intensity at the beginning, first 2 minutes, and then all of a sudden the rest of the movie is leading up to that intense moment. And there's different ways to structure it. I'd love to just get your response, what you have found is effective. And again, I know it all is dependent upon obviously the goal and as well as what the emotion looks like and the hook, et cetera. So kind of help me just lay that out for us.
What you bring up there in Mission Impossible, you see in the Playlist also just did this when they were talking about Spotify's journey. It's called in medias res, right? And it means in the midst of the action. And so there's a couple ways you can use in medias res as you start there and you just move forward. So people are immediately thrown in. It's a little bit like a cold open on maybe like The Office or It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, for instance, where you're just kind of thrown in and you figure it out because humans are smart and we can put the pieces together and build it out. The other way you can do it is what you mentioned there, where you drop them in the action, they get really hooked in, and then you go back towards the beginning and you work your way up to that point, and then you build from there. That's a very effective way of starting any sort of story. Now, many times when we're thinking about startup storytelling, though, it depends who your audience is. So if you're talking to an investor, it's going to feel a little artificial to kind of do like the in medias res play, where you're just dropping them in the midst of the action. They're going to be like, this is kind of a strange way to have a conversation. So the big thing that I tell founders when I work with them is you want to do what I call conversational storytelling, which is a very different kind of storytelling than you would see like a keynote on a TED Talk stage. So conversational storytelling looks way more like a Dave Chappelle, talking to his audience, engaging with them, making jokes and responding to them, right? And that's really what you're doing when you're talking to an investor. So founders need to realize in that situation, what we're trying to do is hook the audience, but not make it feel artificial where it's like, oh, I'm going into presenter mode and telling a story, right? And there's some really interesting things that you can learn about. How do we control the voice to go into presenter mode or more intimate? But when I think about it from like a stage perspective, speaking like in medias res is great. You can look at Brene Brown does this in her TED Talk. It's a very common, technique to just drop someone in the middle of the story. It's a tried and true way to make sure you hook your audience, because it opens a loop is really what happens. So the moment a human has an open loop, we want to close that loop, which keeps them engaged long enough so that you can get them to keep listening. Now, there are other ways to hook your audience. You can ask a big question. You can pose a surprising statistic or number, right? You can do some of these other techniques that allow you to hook them without having to artificially create this action moment. If maybe you don't have it in your story, maybe your story really does need to start kind of from the beginning in order to understand it. And so you may want to hook them with a big question that then leads into this, right? So you can look at great storytellers who do this. Nike does this really well. No surprise there. The way that they structure their stories, you can find different ways that they hook the audience. But if we don't hook the audience in that first 10, 15 seconds, they're going to be gone. They're not going to listen to the rest of it, which is unfortunate because you could have great content, you have a great story, but they're just not going to hear it. So we always want to think through what is the best structure to actually start our talk. And it goes back to this idea of being audience centric. We have to know who we're speaking to. If you're speaking to a potential recruit to join your team or an investor, it's going to be very different than a keynote at TechCrunch where you're talking to a massive audience about what it is you're building, and you want them engaged so that they don't get up and get on their phone and leave and go and talk and network instead. So we always want to think about those dynamics of how we start our talk is a little bit different.
So let me ask you this also with, and I love what you said there in regards to kind of the beginning of it here. At what point do you start getting into like integrating the physiology, the linguistics, the tonality, the cadence of it to make sure that it is resonating? Because I love what you said, conversational versus presentation, because I've heard some where it's total difference, right? Conversation is just, natural and organic. You just feel like, oh, this is awesome. And I've heard some speakers that come in and they have this beautiful voice, wonderful. But the thing is, it's like, this is kind of weird. Like, why are we talking like this? So it's slightly just different. But I know that talks a little bit about tonality. I want to talk about, each one of those that we just mentioned here at a micro level, the importance of it. Because I was looking at body language. I understand there's certain body language, things that you want to do. If you want to, talk negative, you say one side, and then you say opposite, for positive kind of emphasis, etc. There are certain gestures that you can do to make people feel more trusting, comfortable with you, etc., and more dominant, etc., and authority. So I want to just talk about some of these more intricate things.
So the way I think about it, and we can go into all the individual pieces as well, but there's really kind of three levels that I think of when it comes to storytelling. The first is just getting kind of the content pieces right and making the person sound like they've got the fundamentals down of being a speaker. And this means, removing unnecessary filler words. Doesn't mean you have to remove them all. You certainly shouldn't, because then you're going to sound like a robot, but it means understanding how to sound somewhat articulate, right? Where someone listens to you and they're at least going to spend the time of day to get the message. And this is also where we've got to nail down the content, because if your content isn't there, I don't care how great you are at speaking. If the content is garbage and I'm just saying, like you're not paying attention to me, no matter how beautiful I can make that sound, right? Like you're going to be like, this person is an absolute clown. Like, in fact, we might have lost listeners at that point when I just did that. So for all I know, so we've got to dial in the content, right? And also the foundational pieces of speaking. Phase two is where we get into really playing around with delivery components. This is where we start thinking about cadence and rhythm and volume and presence, and thinking about tonality a little bit more, and really building what I call musicality. Musicality is what I think every great speaker has. I've actually spoken to a number of, orchestra musicians about this idea, and we've looked at it. The most memorable speakers have the largest range of dynamics in the way that they speak. And so what I'll actually do when I'm listening to someone speak is I'll start seeing musical notes over the way that they're doing it, the way that they're paired, the way that it plays. And when I'm thinking about that too, and working with founders, oftentimes I'll actually point to them, and many of them aren't musical, so it doesn't make sense to give them musical notes. But what it does make sense to do is say, hey, this section, I want to sound like this part of the JFK speech right here. this part, I want it to sound like this movie scene where this so-and-so was speaking. And we'll give them references so that they can actually hear the difference, because it will be a very different feel and it's musical. JFK is my favorite speaker of all time because his speaking is so musical. If you listen to his speech at Rice University saying, we'll put a man on the moon, it is unbelievably musical. If you can't see musical notes over the way that that man is speaking, you've never listened to music. So it sticks with you because of that reason. So that's kind of phase two. Phase three, though, the level three, is when you can start actually transferring emotion from you to the audience. Now, this is super high level. This is very, very challenging for any speaker to get to. And you have to put a lot of time and effort into phase one and phase two, because you have to just instinctively know what to do from a delivery kind of idea. You've got to know when to dial up volume, when to dial up speed, when to lower it, how to build cadence, how to build that rhythm. And then we can get into the emotion where you're tapping into something personal that then you're allowing to connect to the audience. And so those are kind of the different levels that I would say there. And we can obviously dive into the more specific pieces, but we can't get into the specific piece if we don't understand the foundational levels first of 1, 2, and 3 of where we're going, because too many people try to jump to 3. And if you don't have 1 or 2 down, and the truth is most people will never make it to 3. It's just, that is really for what I call a world-class speaker, a world-class storyteller. That is the best of the best, the top 1%. Just like I say, no matter how much I wanted to be a professional baseball player, the Houston Astros weren't going to let me just play baseball because I said I want to be a professional baseball player. You got to have the talent to get to that level and play it. And the same is true. We're talking about the highest level of speaking and storytelling.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because you're exactly right. I wanted to, loop back around on that. The content is so important because you want to make sure that you've memorized that, you've pitched in your story, you understand that whole thing, because then you're not able to add those intricate details associated. It's just adding almost like a, layered cake, if you will. The more layers that is, the better it is. And I love what you mentioned, JFK. One of the things I always love is like the Ronald Reagan speech, where it's like, tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, and what was so empowering. And even think about FDR when he says, this day will live in infamy. And these speeches, and that's one of the reasons why I want to talk about linguistics, because I actually went to Pearl Harbor, and there was his actual speech, and it was actually so interesting. This day will live in infamy. He actually scratched it out. It was going to be, this day will live in history, but he scratched it out, and it became infamy. It was not even actually titled that talk, but it became that talk because the way he said it. Same thing with, I have a dream speech, right? It wasn't actually, categorized that. But I found so interesting is the terminology, the linguistics that we all have and we can use and employ. And I always found it very interesting. And again, I haven't done as much study as you have, but I'd love to get your perspective on how important it is when you're building the content itself, the linguistics, really just, kind of dialing in every single word and saying, okay, hey, how can we restructure this to maybe, like going with that musical cadence later on, right? Anticipating that we're going to integrate all this stuff, but what other terminology that we can use? What other powerful words or, maybe imagery that we could establish, or feelings, right? My hands were sweating, my pulse was racing, etc. Certain things that help facilitate that emotion that you're going to integrate later on in the conversation.
It's so important to spend time on this stuff, and most people won't because it's hard. It's really hard. One of my good friends is Justin McElroy. He was the former speechwriter for General Petraeus, General Mattis, and Secretary Panetta. And we spent a lot of time talking about this idea, and he would refine talks, 10 times before they were ready to go, because the word choice is so important. And he has a saying, preparation creates precision. And I really do agree with that. Preparation creates precision. So when we think about it, words have power, right? I think words are a form of magic. There's nothing else in the world that allows us to turn nothing into something. We can speak things into existence. So words, if you also look at any of like the magical books, whether it's Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, whatever it is, they're using words to create the spell. And that's the same as humans. We're creating words to create spells. It's actually why I call my company Performative Speaking. Performative means performance art, but the word performativity means the ability for words to bring about change. And so I think about it as art plus change. That's really what it comes down to. So What you want to do is figure out what are the rhetorical devices that we can use to really elevate our speaking. And this is what great speakers understand. Rule of three. You'll see it all over the place. We always are using rules of three. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? Caesar, Veni Vidi Vici. It's a rule of three. Veni Vidi Vici also happens to be a rule of three alliteration because each one is starting with a V. It becomes memorable. It becomes easy for us to share it with other people. It's why when I talk to founders about the startup vision story, I say the startup vision story is based off the 3 Ps: purpose, passion, potential. Again, it's easy to remember. So what we want to look for are these rhetorical devices. We have floating opposites, right? Where something maximizes and minimizes so that it feels like they're further apart. We have things like one unlike the other, where we say two things that are very similar and the third thing is nothing like it at all. And so what speakers and people like myself obsess over is words. And one of my favorite examples of this actually comes from maybe a unexpected source, which is Eminem. Eminem, who's, amazing rapper. I would say the greatest rapper of all time, just from a lyrical perspective. But in his interview that he gave with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes many, many years ago, Anderson Cooper asked him how he can rhyme any of these words. And he says, I've read the dictionary word for word to figure out what words I can use. That means I know every single potential opportunity out there for me to manipulate words and make them sound a different way, to rhyme them and make them have greater meaning. And he has notebook upon notebook upon notebook of lines that he's written out, just testing them. And this is the same process that any speechwriter, any coach like myself, any storyteller will go through, where we're just writing, refining, crossing it out, getting rid of it, thinking through what is the analogy, what's the metaphor, what's the alliteration, what's the word choice that's going to bring this up? Because to your point, this is what sticks with us. JFK's ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country is a rhetorical device as well, where we're playing off of that back to back. Churchill did it too. We will fight, we will fight, we will fight, we will fight, we shall never surrender. And so he's using repetition of we will fight by starting every line with that we will fight over and over and over, where you get in this rhythm and it builds and builds and builds. But then the final one is we shall never surrender, which is actually much stronger in that moment because he laid the groundwork of we will fight, we will fight, we will fight over and over and over again. When you hear it, you're like, whoa, that's different. And we shall never is actually a stronger way of saying it, because you're not saying that we're going to do the affirmative. You're saying we're never going to do the negative. And as a result, that speech was to the Americans, really, although he's speaking to the British people, trying to tell the Americans, if you don't come into the war, we will be wiped out because we will not stop fighting. And it's a way to rally the Americans to basically give them no other option but to come into World War II because of the way that he laid out that speech, because of the way that he wrote the rhetoric. And that is what Churchill was so great at as well. So if we look at the greatest leaders of all time, Obama was beautiful at this as well. He took a very hands-on approach to writing his own speeches. We see the power of words, and that's why people should spend way more time than they do getting it right.
Oh man, you just laid that out so beautifully. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of looping back around to the physiology a little bit. I remember watching the movie because sadly we don't have a video of Winston Churchill. We do have video of other presidents, JFK for example, when he said that, and it was just really just beautiful, and the way he structured it, and the way he obviously emphasized the specific words and how to he controlled the environment of that, but also like the tonality and the cadence of it, and how he led into that before, because he knew how he was going to structure that. Again, Obama is a beautiful orator. My question then is like physiology a little bit. And I know it depends on obviously if you're what industry you're in. Like if you're political, you're behind a podium, et cetera, et cetera. There are certain things you want to do. I'm curious, like obviously, definitely in whether you're like one-on-one versus a group, whether it's through a conversation, et cetera. What are certain things that you could do to present this this confidence, but also this authority, but also this kind of control?
So much just comes down to comfort we have as ourselves, right? And the confidence that we have in our own ability to show up and present. And so when we feel like we belong in a place, we show up differently. So shoulders are more back, we're more open. We're going to move our hands more like this because it's just like, hey, we're engaged in a conversation. So we're kind of in that space. You're not afraid to take up space. So what we can see a lot of times when people feel uncomfortable is they try to get really small. So if they're at a podium, they'll try to hide behind it. If they're up on stage, they're going to get really narrow. They're going to bring their hands in. They're going to protect them. They're going to do kind of the old fig leaf move, because they're trying to protect themselves because they feel unsafe. And what we want instead is just to be very natural, just to be open, just to be speaking in a pacing that demonstrates confidence, which is actually much slower than people realize. So when you're actually speaking and trying to demonstrate confidence to an audience, you're generally in the 120 to 160 words per minute. In fact, you can look at Obama, Malala, JFK, they all were in the neighborhood of 80, like high 80s to 120s, oftentimes when they're speaking publicly, to really allow their message to sink in, because they're just totally confident in what they're delivering. So we can look at these people as inspiration sources, but when it comes to the physiology, so much of the physiology actually just comes from this thing up here. What we believe in our mind shows up in how we present to the world. If I think, oh, I'm nervous, guess what? I'm going to show up as nervous to the world. If I think, oh, this is a great opportunity for me to do something really cool, I'm going to show up that way. If I think that I belong on stage, on a big stage, speaking to people, I'm going to show up in a way that demonstrates I belong on stage. If I feel, I'm not sure that I'm supposed to be here, I'm going to show up in ways that demonstrates I don't belong on the stage. So much of what our physiology does is based on how we're thinking, how we think about ourselves, how we think about our message. And so this is why one of the biggest pieces actually solve presence, body language, all these different things, is not to get into the nitty gritty of, well, you need to do this in order to appear confident. We actually just have to train this thing up here, the mind, to really dial it in so that when you're on that stage, or you're in that conversation, or you're in that boardroom, you show up as the best version of yourself because you're confident and you feel comfortable in that setting. That's really where physiology starts to shine, is once we've dialed in the mindset stuff.
So let's talk a little bit more about this, because and I know you mentioned Dave Chappelle, he's a comedian, and I've studied a lot of comedians, and I find this so interesting. Any comedian, well, I should say any comedian, quite a few comedians can get up on the stage, do their thing. But what I always found interesting is the creativity when they're dealing with hecklers, or they're engaging almost improv with the audience. And I'm curious, I want to talk a little bit about this, because naturally, throughout any speaking engagement, throughout any situation, there's always going to be, you're in the middle of the story, there's always going to be a distraction. So you have to anticipate distractions. You've seen this in the political realm, people, hecklers, whatever. And what I found so interesting is some of the presidents, they do such an excellent job at just elegantly still controlling the atmosphere, saying something funny, and then moving it on. They have it all under control, almost like they've anticipated something. And I do think that there has to be some training associated. Now, I know we're getting a higher level a little bit, but I want to just talk a little bit about this, because that's just a personal question of mine. I found that so intriguing that people can almost anticipate. They have certain things that they know, hey, this is what I'm going to use to deploy in this circumstance, XYZ.
So this kind of goes into impromptu speaking, and there's two ways that we prepare for impromptu speaking. There is the foundational pieces of understanding frameworks that you have, the kind of levers that you can pull in impromptu speaking so that you get more comfortable, so you don't get flustered by things. Right? And this is what I call macro preparation. We're really preparing you to be a great impromptu speaker on a macro level. So no matter what's thrown at you, you know that if I get a tough question or someone responds to me in a way that I don't like, instead of responding instinctively, instead of reflexively being upset or getting defensive or getting aggressive, we're going to sit and take that and listen and calm ourselves for 2-3 seconds, think through the proper response, and then casually give it to somebody where it shows that we're still in control. And so we learn these macro skills to build that impromptu speaking muscle. A lot of what I did in a courtroom was impromptu speaking. So I went into a courtroom every single day with a judge, and I had no idea most of the time what was going to happen. I just prepared on a macro level where I could handle whatever was thrown my way. But then you also have the micro preparation. Micro preparation is when you're going in specific settings, you can anticipate what's going to come up. Barack Obama had this in I think it was a State of the Union or some major address that he gave inside of Congress. But at the time, the Republicans were very happy that he was going to be leaving office after, at the next election, because he was ending his term. And they gave a bunch of applause when he announced, that this would be kind of like his last one that he was giving inside of Congress. And of course, he's ready for this. So he just casually lets them do that. And then he has this quip that he gives to them about, yeah, I know I have to leave because I never lost an election. And it's just like this moment where he was prepared for it. And that's what you want to do on a micro level. So if you're in an interview, right? If you're, on CNBC or some sort of money show is talking to you about the recent Series A or Series B that you just raised, which happens. I've had a number of founders go on to these shows. Sometimes they'll send the questions to tell them prepare for these, and then they'll kind of surprise them when they get on camera. Well, we're not stupid. We know that they're going to try to get these aha moments. So what do? We prepare the questions that they've already sent, and then we think, what are the other questions that might come up that you should at least be aware of? And so then I just will play that and start peppering the founder with those so that when they get them, because sure enough, they come up on TV, they've already heard that question. And so they're somewhat prepared for it with an answer. So we have to think about impromptu speaking from a macro level and a micro level. And then the other piece of this is when you've prepared well enough with your prepared remarks and you're totally comfortable with that and you've internalized it, it's way easier to be flexible and nimble in the moment because you're no longer worried, well, am I going to get distracted and lose my place in the talk? Because if you haven't done enough work, you're going to be like, oh, this is a disaster. I don't know what to do. And then you're going to freak out. And then all of a sudden it's, I've got to answer this, but I've got to try to get back and I don't know what to do. And now it's all chaos. But if you prepared that prepared speech properly and really nailed it down, and you have this micro and this macro preparation for impromptu speaking, nothing can really blow you off course. And that's kind of the powerful thing when you actually go back to proper preparation.
Yeah, I actually did a TEDx talk just recently, and building the foundation, understanding the content itself, developing the structure of it, the linguistics, and then when I'm going to deploy certain things and how I'm going to structure it. It was actually quite a bit of process. It was quite fun. That's why I just love this conversation because, again, I am not at that level, but I would love to, and obviously analyzing that and, like you mentioned, integrating that. I'm curious, we've talked a lot about the structure of this, the methodology behind it, the 5 pillars, like you mentioned. What are the big don'ts? Like certain things like, hey, do not. One of the things that I always found interesting, I just want to get your perspective on this, Robbie, is I always have a difficult feeling when all of a sudden the speaker is almost like devaluing the audience, almost like, oh, you guys are pathetic, you guys are horrible, not in a joking way, almost like they are meaning it, like you guys are stupid, etc. And I'd love to get your response on that because I never found that was effective. But maybe it is. I would just love to get your response on like what are big don'ts that every speaker should stay away from.
There's definitely a difference, right, between challenging the audience and demeaning the audience. And it's okay to challenge the audience, but you should not demean them, right? I think that's the difference because at the end of the day, the audience is giving you their time, their attention, and that is a form of currency. And the speaker, the CEO, the executive, the founder who's speaking, whether it's to an investor or they're speaking to an audience of their employees or they're on stage at some sort of event, we need to respect that because that is not a small ask in today's world. People have lots going on. We need to be aware of that. But when I think about it, some of the biggest no's that I see don't do's when it comes to, especially a lot of, the CEO crowd, the executive crowd, the founder crowd that I'm kind of dealing with on a daily basis, is the first is we have to realize, stop talking in jargon and buzzwords because nobody cares and it's a disaster and it makes it sound like you don't actually know what you're talking about. The second thing is it's not about you, the speaker, right? Now, it doesn't mean that you don't share personal stories and you don't share personal insights, but it's really not about you. It is about how this is going to affect the audience. So we always want to be thinking through what is that audience message that I can put out there. So even if I'm sharing a personal story, I'm trying to share a personal story so somebody can attach to that and say, oh, I see what Robbie did there. Here's how I could use it in my own life, right? The example that I gave on that murder case where I was defending the person who killed his brother. I want someone to see you can take an inspiration source from something like The West Wing and use it to go out there and have these really impressive results that, it might be a job promotion. It might be a salary increase for them, or it might be they land their next round of investment, or they're able to create the strategic narrative change that needs to happen in their organization as a CEO, and they're able to distill that down to their entire company and they get buy-in for it. So stories, even if they're about you, should have some sort of tie-in to what your audience can do with them. Some of the other no's, right, are trying to think by speaking fast and giving more that it demonstrates that you are smarter, when in fact, boiling things down to the simplest term and speaking in a very calm and controlled way so people can absorb the message is actually a stronger signal of a true leader. where they're just so comfortable in their own ability to say, this is the core thing that you need to know, that I don't need to try to overwhelm you. A lot of novice speakers, novice CEOs, founders who are just trying to appear more impressive than they are, try to overwhelm by brute force and being like, I'm just going to throw all this at you and you're going to see how smart I am. But that's not the case. We want the least possible information to get the most message across and leave the biggest impact. So these are some of like the quick no's, don't do's that I see come up time and time again, that if you can remove them, you'll be far more impactful as a leader, as a CEO, as a founder, as a storyteller.
This is interesting. Let me ask you in regards to your journey, what skills did you have to become aware? Like what were some like that were innate to you? Like, okay, this is awesome. Maybe you're very charismatic, maybe you have, strong self-confidence, like, hey, I was in a courtroom, whatever, what were some skills that you had to really kind of work on much more from all that we've discussed?
One of the big ones, and this probably isn't a surprise because I think lawyers just have this tendency, and actually, interestingly enough, a lot of founders and CEOs have it too, is moving from arrogance to what I call delusional confidence. And I'll say this because when I was a young lawyer, I was arrogant. I thought that I was the best in the courtroom. I thought nobody could teach me anything. So I had this confidence, as we would see it, but it didn't connect to the jurors or the judge. In fact, it created this kind of barrier between us because they saw me as arrogant. What I had to realize was really what I'm trying to create is delusional confidence. And I'll kind of define what I mean by that with some examples. This is something that you see like Arnold Schwarzenegger early in his life, when he said he was going to be Mr. Olympia. He was going to be a movie star. He was going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And he didn't say it in this arrogant way. He just said it as he knew what the future already held. He had this sense of foresight, of destiny, of legacy that he was going to be able to build, and time was just catching up. So he was fully confident in himself. And the reason I say it's delusional confidence is because when I feel that about myself and where I'm going on my journey, most people might look at that and say, that's crazy. But in order to do massively impressive things, those people are always seen as crazy early on until it becomes true. So it's delusional early on because you have that confidence and people see it as delusional, and you're not going to let their no's or their doubts or their nagging bring you back down because you know what you can achieve. But it's not coming from a place of, I know everything, I'm smarter than everyone. It's the confidence to say, I want to create this mechanism, this feedback loop where I take insight in from other people and I improve myself and I fix the weaknesses so that I can get to the goal that I have, but I know that I'm going to get to that goal. That's kind of the difference. So for me, that was a big unlock that I had to kind of figure out, is how do I go from arrogance to delusional confidence? Because delusional confidence made people connect to me, where they felt like I was a real person, that they could be a friend with me, that they could have a conversation, whereas arrogance pushed everyone away. So that was one of the big ones that came from me. Speaking was one of those things that just kind of came naturally. I didn't realize that that was a unique thing until later on in life. Now, I will say this. I had both a stutter and a lisp growing up. So early on, I was very uncomfortable speaking. But once I got to high school, I became aware that I was good at it. And then it was really, once you find something you're good at, you double down and continue just to refine it, and get to a point where it's where you want it to be. And to be honest, I'm still not there. I still have things to improve. I work with voice coaches and other speakers, and just refining those narrowest margins to continue to grow as a speaker. But it's dangerous to be arrogant. It's great to be delusional confident, because that's where so much of the magic happens. You see the book Steve Jobs behind me. That man had delusional confidence. He was able to achieve great things. That you all see the books Dune behind me. If you look at Dune and you look at the original one, Paul has delusional confidence as well in terms of what he's going to be able to achieve. So I think that's what we're always trying to find as a speaker, is so that you show up and people can feel the confidence, but they don't feel like you're pushed away.
This is an interesting concept, and it almost is like a subconscious play a little bit, where you may not, it's not like you're having to say certain things. It's more of, they just can feel the vibe a little bit. And I'm curious, coming back to this, and I think this is good to talk a little bit about this, because I have talked to investors that, and I've done enough homework on that investor that I know what resonates with them. They're just down to earth, they're family oriented. right? Some are more resume builders where, hey, did you go to Harvard? Did you go to Yale? Did you go to Stanford? You know what I mean? All that stuff. And so it's almost, it depends upon who you're talking to, again, the audience, et cetera. But you want to make sure that you adjust your vernacular or your story or whatever, and as well as your appearance, what I've noticed. And so I'm just curious, coming back to your trial time, did you change, or did you dress differently to feel more comfortable? Like you mentioned, that delusion confident, you still came in confident, you still came in, but maybe you left the Rolodex at home, or not the Rolodex, the Rolex at home, or maybe the Gucci shoes or whatever. Like some things you kind of dialed down a little bit because you wanted to make people feel comfortable a little bit around you. Maybe not the 3-piece suit. I'm just curious, like what other things did you do to be able to present yourself, confidently, authoritative, controlling, physiological, but also having that, delusional confidence, or does it not really play into it? Because I know Steve Jobs, he just had a, turtleneck and freaking jeans. He still changed the world. So I'm just curious.
Oh, I wish I could say that I was sporting a Rolex back in those days, but I don't think people realize how poorly paid prosecutors are, even when they're trying child abuse cases and murder cases in Dallas, Texas. You do it because you love the work, because it has real meaning to provide justice to those victims. You're not doing it because you're being paid well. I assure you, you are not. But I do think it's important to show up to the world the way that you want to be seen, right? And so as a lawyer, that means having well-tailored suits. That means dressing the part. But so much of this, honestly, goes back to what brought that out in me was I also was a competitive CrossFit athlete during that period of time. And so as a result, I really care about physical fitness, being in shape, because if I'm in shape and can take care of myself, I show up to the world in a different way. And, making sure that an audience is receptive to how I show up, like the appearance does matter. People do judge a book by its cover. And so you are aware of those things, just like I'm aware of those things today when I show up to certain events. Like I'm not dressed in a suit and tie anymore. I'm dressed in athleisure, or I'm dressed in a sweater like this, because the world I work in is tech. I work in with startups, founders, scale ups, and then, public companies who are in the tech world, and they dress a certain way. And so if your audience is going to be comfortable by that, then you want to make sure that they feel comfortable, right? And we can actually create this neurological bond by letting them see, hey, I'm just like you. I'm one of you. It creates a sense of safety, right? So you are aware of that. But again, going back and I continue to take part in, I don't compete anymore, but I still believe physical fitness is great. One, for people take you more seriously when they see that you've stayed in shape, just because they know that it takes time. It's not easy, especially as you get older. You have to really prioritize getting into the gym and taking care of yourself. So if I see someone that is like that, and many of the founders I work with, they're at the gym 5 a.m. every day, because that's the time that they can get there and get it done before they work all day long. And it sends a signal. Oh, they take care of themselves. They prioritize their health and prioritize taking care of themselves so that they can put in the hours, that they can deal with the stress, so that when they show up to meetings, they send the right signal. All of that is an important piece of just human nature, whether we like it or not. That's the reality. And sometimes we got to deal in the world of reality instead of the world of fantasy land that we may wish was the case. So I continue to do that. It was a huge kind of separator when I was a trial lawyer too, because when I showed up, I looked the part of a prosecutor. I was, clean haircut, very conservative, clean shaven. So the things that you're talking about, yes, you're definitely aware of those. I'm not doing things that are overly flashy because I want people to take me seriously, but not be like, he kind of has this vibe about him. It was always more about how can I make sure the jury likes me, but doesn't go beyond that, because then they would focus on my message and they would focus on the story instead of focusing on me.
Very well said, man. Robbie, I appreciate this conversation so much, man. I know you laid down the foundation, and then we're talking higher level stuff and, kind of that next level. I've taken so many notes over here personally. I'm like, man, I should have added this. And I'm just thinking of all the times when I should have done this and should have done that. So, from here on out, I'm gonna re-listen to this. And for those that are listening, that want to engage with what you got going on, Robbie, whether they're a founder or whether they want to go out there and just learn more about your methodologies and understand much more, you have an incredible amount of resources here, my man. How do they reach out to you? How do they be part of your ecosystem?
So the place that I post the most content, and it's available freely every day, is on LinkedIn. So that's an easy place to find me. Robbie Crabtree, you can search that, you'll find me. You can also sign up for the free newsletter that I run, which is called the Storytellers Playbook. That's a once a week free newsletter where we dive deep into everything storytelling, founder, fundraising, any of those pieces, mindset, all the things we've talked on today. We do 2,000 to 2,500 word deep dives every single Sunday, so people can really look at all the research and the things that I'm pulling from to come up with these ideas. And then, of course, they can check out the website, which is performativespeaking.com. And from there, they can reach out to me through the website or on LinkedIn if they want to learn more about what I do, how I work, just have questions. We love the work we do, and we're really trying to change the conversation around storytelling and really what that means, and create a world of what we call chief storytelling officers, so that we can really move the future in the direction that we need. Because at the end of the day, there are big problems to solve, and we need amazing people to go out there and make it happen.
Yeah, and guys, he's also got a book coming out here in Q1 of next year, which we're really excited about. And hopefully I didn't pre-release that, but it's very excited. But guys, those links are in the description below, so make sure it's performativespeaking.com. I'll put his LinkedIn account down there as well, so you guys can consume and you guys can be part of his ecosystem. Now, Robbie, normally I ask my guests, any wisdom that you'd like to share, but I want to ask you. The last thing that I would like for you to share is a success story, someone that has worked with you, because you've worked with so many different founders, and just talk a little bit about their evolution and where they're at now, man.
I'm going to share one of my favorite stories and people I've worked with, and it was the chief medical officer and co-founder of the company Levels, and her name is Casey Means, and she was surgeon, she was a doctor, she did all the crazy things, and saw that there were massive problems inside of the health system and wanted to find a way to solve those. And so Levels was the way to help that by attacking metabolic disease, by being able to give people wearables so that they can get their own information about their health and really get that message out to the world. But as you can imagine, sharing medical information and scientific information to a general audience can be challenging. And so that's what me and Casey worked with quite a bit, is how can you use storytelling to speak in public, on podcasts, on panels, on the news, all over the place, to really get this message out, to make sure that people understand how impactful this is going to be, not only for their own lives, but for the greater good across the world. And so by working together, Casey was able to really elevate and become really that musical speaker that I talked about, is able to share stories that connect to people. And over the last, year and a half now of watching that evolution, she's been able to do amazing things like building a, Instagram audience and getting verified and almost getting to, I think, 100,000 at this point followers. They just released a beautiful, beautiful series around healthy cooking that's going to really help people to keep their metabolic health in check. They've been able to go out and raise a $38 million Series A round recently with a ton of input from their own customer base, and really just taking a leadership role in redefining what healthcare looks like moving forward in the future. And so that's the type of stuff that I love, because Casey is the perfect founder to work with, because she knows storytelling matters, she knows speaking matters, and she is just relentless in her pursuit of improvement so that she can connect the message to more people and really change lives. And that's the sort of stuff that I just love to do.
So powerful, man. I appreciate that transformative story, man, and that case study. And I appreciate what you're doing out there. Guys, that is the CEO and founder of Performative Speaking, my friend, Robbie Crabtree. Guys, that a Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can. Yo, this is Christian D. Evans, Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. We thank you so much for listening to this amazing episode. If you feel and you know that this was valuable to you, please show some love to our amazing guest by liking this, by commenting on this, by making sure that you do a nice 5-star review, and just show some love to our guest. That'd be really awesome. Also, make sure you share this with a friend, a family, a colleague, someone that you believe would
bring value to their life right now. And guys, we just want to say thank you again for just being part of our community. If you want to have more resources, don't be afraid. Go to christiandeevans.com. You can actually schedule a phone call with me, or you can send me an email at christian.evans@beUncommonIfYouCan.com. That's christian.evans@beUncommonIfYouCan.com. Always love to hear some feedback, and let me know what is the number 1 or 2 things that you are struggling in your business and your life, and we'll make sure we have those conversations. Guys, that is Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast, and until next time, remember, be uncommon if you can. Cheers.